Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight. My name is John Paul Newman. I'm Associate Professor of Contemporary European History at Maynooth University in Ireland, and I'm also the current president of the Irish Association for Russian, Central and Eastern European Studies. And the association, along with the Moores Institute at the University of Galway, will be co-hosting this evening's session. I'll be moderating, and I'm going to very briefly explain the format tonight, and then I'll move straight onto our speakers. So we have five short papers, five speakers. Each speaker will present their topic, present their research. They'll speak for between 5 to 7 minutes. We'll go for each one of our speakers, and at the end, I'll invite our panelists to respond to what they have heard so far. And after that, after the second part of our discussion, I'll open up the floor to the audience, and you can ask your questions either to the panel generally, or if you would like to address your questions to a specific panel member and their topic, by all means, you can do that as well. It's a webinar format this evening, so the questions will be, you can type your questions into the Q&A, and I'll attempt to get to all of them, if not as many as possible. So that's how we're going to do it. And in that case, I'll go straight to our first speaker. I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Tanya Lokot. Tatiana is the Associate Professor in Digital Media and Society at the School of Communications, Dublin College University. And she is the author of Beyond the Protest Square, Digital Media and Augmented Dissent, which was published by Ronan Littlefield last year, 2021. And Dr. Lokot's paper this evening is titled Ukrainian Resistance and Mobilization, National and Transnational Dynamics and Decolonial Histories. So Tatiana, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, John Paul, and good evening, everyone. I wouldn't maybe go so far as to call it a paper, but just perhaps some thoughts gathered together. What I'd like to focus on very briefly is just to reflect on, the current events on the ground in Ukraine, and try to frame them a little bit on the civic participation and the participation of both Ukrainians in Ukraine and Ukrainians outside of Ukraine in the mobilization around Russia's invasion, and just to try and put them into a slightly historical lens, but also a post-colonial lens, and to understand the dynamics of this mobilization. So obviously, Ukraine is known as a country with large diasporas abroad, and they have historically played a very important role in the political and social changes within the country. We also know that diasporas are fairly complex actors because they arise out of multiple histories of transborder movements, spurred on by various instances of injustice, persecution, and displacement, but also economic hardship and the search of a better life. And in this particular instance, we're also talking about diaspora and their participation, not just as global actors that are somehow affecting change from outside of the country, but that are intimately involved in the changes happening inside the country. And this has been true throughout Ukraine's history, and more recently, throughout the very tumultuous political changes in 2005, 2014, and the Revolution of Dignity, and obviously since then, in the simmering conflict, and now a full-scale war of aggression on Russia's part. We have a growing body of scholarship that suggests we look at diasporic mobilization through a post-structuralist lens, and that we pay attention not just to the sort of structures, but also to the discourses, the affect, and the publics that are shaped by this affect, and the collective imaginaries that bring diasporas as agents of collective change, but also collective memory construction, and they become an inseparable part of the changes happening inside the country. In this regard, I think it's also important to understand why we are now arguing more than ever that it's important to consider Ukraine as a nation and its history through a decolonial perspective. It's not perhaps a very popular stance, although it's becoming more popular. we don't typically think of Ukraine as a country kind of in the imaginary global south, but maybe a country in the global east. But there are complex histories and geographies that reach beyond and before the USSR and Ukraine's experiences therein. As Tlostanova contends, experiences of post-communism often intersect with those of post-coloniality, and nowhere is this more true than in the Ukrainian case. So we could consider, as Zhikovich suggests, that this particular instance of post-communism in Ukraine is a non-classical instance of post-coloniality, because we recognize that non-linear temporalities shape the contemporary moment in Ukraine, particularly with attention to certain communities that don't necessarily fit linear definitions of progress in more mainstream conditionings of post-Soviet time and space. So Ukrainians, both inside the country and outside the country, the diasporic communities, find themselves in this geopolitically fraught space of multiple geographical delineations of Ukraine that is inextricably tied to the Western world, and yet is also connected through its history to those peripheral spaces of norms, standards, and values. So Ukrainians perceive themselves as part of the Western world and the Western democratic societies, but also as being on the outside as the other. And this duality owes as much to Ukraine's own fraught post-communist past as to the continued suspicion with which the Western world tends to view transitional democracies such as Ukraine. Obviously Ukraine's colonial past is not in question here. Throughout its history for the past 300 years, it's been subject to various forms of imperial and colonial rule. It may have never officially been a colony, but it had the status of an imperial borderland, as evidenced by the literal translation of its name into the English language, and the fact that many today continue to wrongly refer to the country as the Ukraine, a rhetorical move that undermines Ukrainian sovereignty and reinforces its marginal status of a territory within a larger imperial formation. And this highlights the lasting impact of imperialisms, including Russia's imperialisms, on Ukraine, that Ukrainians continue to experience, right? And it also carries a legacy of physical and epistemic violence experienced by the local population, as Ukrainian language and identity had often been maintained and negotiated as an act of resistance to the homogenizing influence of other cultures and religious doctrines. So these conditions have shaped very much the way mobilization, political and social and civic, within Ukraine and within the global transnational Ukrainian community have shaped over the past decades, and especially over the past 10, 15 years. We can also witness an increasing role here played by the Ukrainian diasporas. They have historically obviously played an important role in negotiating Ukraine's status, Ukrainian identity, preserving parts of Ukrainian identity when they were endangered inside the country. So they've served as sort of keepers of ontological categories related to being Ukrainian, and played a crucial role in creating what made Ukraine and Ukrainians known to the world. And we can refer, for instance, back to the translation, the diasporic mobilization that took place in the 1930s during the time of the Holodomor and artificially created hunger genocide, where diasporas played a crucial part in actually explaining to the rest of the world what was happening in Ukraine, what was happening to the country. So we can say that in a sense, diasporas and those individuals that are more permanently or temporarily involved in diasporic communities, they play a role of translocal actors because they're both global and local. And they use moments of mobilization also as opportunities to articulate or translate what is happening in the country and what is the country, bridging those discourses and vocabularies of their homeland and the broader world. And this is exactly what we also see happening today, but also in obviously the digital space, when we see Ukrainians everywhere suddenly joining in to participate not only in material support of their countrymen on the ground, but also in this massive process of articulation of the claims of the anti-war resistance, and also translation, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, what is actually happening on the ground. So what we're seeing now, we see a huge scale of these diasporic translation efforts, both in terms of translating the meaning of events, translating what is actually happening on the ground, and literal translation of messages and independent reporting into multiple languages around the world to make them available. And these efforts are incredibly consequential because they introduce the voices of Ukrainians, the grammars and the vocabularies of the Ukrainian stance and the Ukrainian identity in this conflict, and make them visible and make them available to the broader world. And thus, all of this is obviously also happening in a very contested information space where there are also other narratives and other grammars and other vocabularies that are being pushed by the other side in the conflict, the aggressive side. So it's very important here to understand this in, again, a post-colonial context, and that these are traditions of struggle that have been present for Ukraine and for Ukrainians for generations. They're not necessarily new. And so these practices of interpretation, translation, articulation are sort of embedded into the very nature of Ukrainian diasporas and diasporic networks that exist in the world today. So we can understand Ukrainian diasporas and their connections with networks of Ukrainians on the ground as complex assemblages of personal and shared histories, tensions, hopes, and grievances. And these are sharing in both collective and personal identities that we are now witnessing through digital network spaces. So it's very important to understand that all of this massive social media activity and digital activity is not something that is new. It's a continuation that grows out of these existing histories of diasporas serving as translators and agents of translation and articulation. So again, just to point out that all of these efforts have a history, and they have roots in not only the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 and not even the Orange Revolution, but years and generations before them. And so in order to understand either the mobilization potential or the scale of these efforts, we do need to look back in history, and we do need to contend with Ukraine's colonial past and its post-colonial present. So I think that's just an important point that we can settle on to sort of start us off. I'll stop there, and then I'll let other colleagues continue with other perspectives that I think will allow us to see the fuller picture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for getting us off to a terrific start, Tanya. Our next two papers, our next two presenters will give a historical dimension, a historical frame to some of the contemporary issues surrounding the war in Ukraine. So we'll start with Maciej. He is a tutor and PhD candidate researching nationalism and nation formation at the National University of Ireland in Galway. Maciej's paper is titled Putin's Historical Propaganda and the Reality of Ukrainian Nationalism. So Maciej, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. So first of all, I would like to wish all the best to all the ladies, since it's the 8th of March and Women's Day. And so I will, as Jean-Paul had said, I will focus on the historical propaganda of Putin that is disregarding the alleged nation of Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian nation. So many have heard the bizarre speech delivered by Mr. Putin on the evening before the invasion. This propagandist justification for invasion aimed to delegitimize the state and presenting it as a creation of Lenin, Stalin, and the Soviet Union in general. And nations, however, are not a creation of a single person, group, or a decision of a central committee. It's not enough to demarcate the borders and say, here you are, from now on you're Ukrainians, be grateful to us. But it doesn't work this way. The history of Ukraine is as rich as that of any other nation in Europe, and as much as there is no strict linear continuity from Kievan Rus in the Middle Ages to Cossack hetmanate until the end of the 18th century to nowadays Ukraine, Ukraine has a distinct political, cultural, and religious history from that of Russia, Poland, and its other neighbors. So politically, The people of Ukraine had made their bids for independence and sovereignty numerous times in their history. Nationalists did not play any role in these attempts until the early 20th century. However, the unified political community governed by the military democracy of the Cossacks, right, in which they were the stakeholders and participated in decision-making, provided a historical, cultural, and political base for the future Ukrainian nationalism. One important thing to understand here is that although our understanding of nation is strictly modern and based on the processes that happen in the last 2 centuries, like industrialization, modernization, state centralization, the spread of mass education, the nationalization as a process has its roots even deeper in a historical memory, myths, stories, songs, folklore, and overall culture. So just to move to a few things that are often brought as an evidence of Ukraine being historically part of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, and therefore being Ukrainians and Russians being the same, stuff that is always brought about, and Putin brought it as well. It's the Treaty of Pereslav in 1654. And the second thing is the Orthodox religion and the Moscow's claim to dominion over the monopoly of over all the Eastern Orthodox Christians. So the first one was a treaty between the Cossacks, between the Cossack hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the Tsar of Russia, in which the Cossacks promised allegiance to the Tsar during the Khmelnytsky's uprising against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And the second one was a claim that Moscow, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, became a third Rome and should exercise, therefore should exercise dominion over the rest of the Orthodox Christians. So the first claim can be easily countered by numerous attempts by the Cossacks to get out of this terrible deal, like the Treaty of Hadziach in 1658, just 4 years after the Pereslav, which was an attempt to change and reform the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and turn it into Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to equate the Ruthenians with Poles and Lithuanians politically. But also by the fact that the Cossacks and later Ukrainians sided with anybody who could help them to get out of the Kremlin's domination. So Poles, Swedes, Austrian, Germans, and even Hitler himself. So second claim, namely that of the primacy of Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow, was also challenged by Kyiv for centuries and culminated in 2019, quite recently, by granting Ukrainian Orthodox Church autocephaly, that means an autonomy, and it's an autonomic state, autonomic church now. So other things, the other thing is also the existence of the Unite Church that was created during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Greek Catholic Church, that pays allegiance to the Pope in Rome. And that was created in 1596 and broke much of the unity between the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians and those of Russia. So this church was suppressed by the Russian authorities throughout the 18th and 19th century in Ukraine and Belarus, but flourished in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and became one of the strongholds of Ukrainian nationalists. Many Ukrainian nationalists of the 19th and 20th century came from the families of Unite priests, and one of them, for example, was Stefan Bandera. So I have mentioned Hitler, and now Stefan Bandera, and this brings us to another claim of Russian propaganda, namely that of the Ukrainian Nazism, supposed Nazism. So, but like the other claims, this one is also taken out of the historical context. Ukrainian nationalists tried to carve out a piece of land under the sun for themselves, and in the 1940s, the only power that could help them gain independence was the Nazi Germany, especially after its invasion of the Soviet Union. And we have to remember that Ukrainians, in the eyes of the Nazi racial worldview, were the Untermenschen, the inferior people, and they could not count on the equal treatment and by the Germans, and were used just as disposable tools here by Hitler for his politics. So, nevertheless, the Russian propaganda follows the same pattern as the Soviets did when dealing to anybody who strive for independence from Moscow. So, describing them as fascists or Nazis, the same fate happened to much of the Polish resistance during after the Second World War. You know, the Home Army in Poland also suffered similar fate. So. Ukrainian nationalism, we remember, it was an intellectual current that grew steadily throughout the 19th and 20th century. And it started before anybody heard of Hitler, Soviet Union, or even Karl Marx. And this growth was especially pronounced in a relatively free political system of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there were many historians like Kostomarov, Drochmanov, Khrushchevsky, geographers, ethnographers, and poets like Taras Shevchenko, and priests who devoted themselves to educated, mostly literate Ukrainian peasants about their history. So their support grew, and so the number of newspapers, social institutions, and political parties, to the extent that they were able to send their representatives to the parliaments in Lviv and Vienna before the World War I. But after World War I was the first great chance to establish a real Ukrainian independent nations, and Ukrainians made two attempts after 1918, both failed, and the first one with the capital in Lviv.
Just 1 minute, Maciej.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So the first one in Lviv was Western Ukrainian People's Republic that was abolished after a short Polish-Ukrainian War in 1918 and 19. And the second was Ukrainian People's Republic in Kiev that was also established in 1918, but beaten into submission by the Bolsheviks by the end of 1920. So much of the Western Ukrainian elites, like nobility, aristocracy, were Polonized throughout the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this did not change much after the partition of Poland, but the Ukrainian nation grew from bottom up and against the ruling states, the power elites, and the prevailing high cultures of the states and under which the Ukrainians lived. So I'm going to finish here. I had other things, but they're less important. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that, Maciej. We might get a chance to hear more about that in the discussion session. So thank you. We'll move on to our next speaker. It is Dr. Róisín Healy. Dr. Healy is Senior Lecturer at the Department of History at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and is the author. Her most recent work is Nationalist Violence in Ireland and Western Ukraine, Political Assassinations Compared, 1882 to 1934. That's an essay published in Ireland and Ukraine, Studies in Comparative, Imperial and National History, forthcoming with Columbia University Press. It'll be out in May of this year. Dr. Healy's paper is titled Ireland and Ukraine, Historical Parallels. So go ahead, Róisín.
Thanks, John Paul. It's hard to imagine worlds further apart than Ukraine and Ireland today, as we sit here in the security of a stable political regime, while our fellow Europeans in Ukraine find themselves forced to flee, endure, or resist the Russian invasion. Yet, as nations that came late to statehood, Ireland and Ukraine have much in common, at least until 1922. Both suffered from the imperial ambitions of their neighbours, if in Ireland's case, just the one. The expansion of England into Ireland and Russia and Poland into Ukraine created or bolstered an ethnic elite at odds with the bulk of the population. The Anglo-Irish ascendancy had their counterpart in the Poles and Russians of Ukraine, who owned much of the land, dominated the towns, spoke their own versions of Slavic, and in some cases espoused a different faith. The governments of both Ireland and Ukraine systematically subordinated the economic interests of their peoples to those of the core. The famines endured by both Ireland in the 1840s, Ukraine in the 1930s, provide the most egregious example. While not designed as genocide, both famines were exacerbated by the contempt of central governments for the well-being of peoples on the periphery, peoples of Ireland and Ukraine. The death toll was very similar, about 1/8 of the population in each case, 1 million in Ireland, 4 million in Ukraine. Although it should be pointed out that the Ukrainian population recovered within a couple of decades, whereas the Irish population continued to decline for over a century. That said, Irish nationalists were able to exploit the famine for full political advantage, whereas Ukrainians were forbidden to speak of it in public or in private until 1989. But as Tanya was pointing out earlier, the diaspora played a very important role in keeping the memory of the famine alive for Ukrainians outside the Ukraine. And that's something that should be noted too. Ireland's diaspora was active, but in slightly different ways, certainly emphasizing the economic plight, but also being very active in organizing terrorist attacks through the Fenians, founded in 1858. The English government in Ireland and the regimes that governed Ukraine undermined native culture too. From the time of the Reformation, the English suppressed Catholic religious practice and barred Catholics from political office and university education. The creation of a national school system through English in 1831, followed by the loss of millions of native Irish speakers through famine and emigration, were further blows. British rule became more benign after the famine, but the experience and memory of religious persecution, famine, and the massive land confiscations of earlier centuries propelled Irish nationalism for generations. The worst was yet to come for Ukraine. From the 1860s, the Poles who dominated Western Ukraine, first under Austro-Hungary and then in independent Poland, suppressed the Ukrainian language and persecuted Ukrainian nationalists. Russia, both before and after 1917, was more aggressive. It abolished, as Maciej was saying, the Uniate or Greek Catholic Church, a compromised church formed in 1596 that owed allegiance to the Pope while maintaining Orthodox rites. In 1863, Russia banned the use of the Ukrainian language in public and in print. Indeed, apart from a lull between 1905 and the early decades of Bolshevik rule, Russia systematically privileged its own language and people over indigenous Ukrainian speakers. As in Ireland, language shift happened by a process of attrition. Years of official denigration and underinvestment led many people in Ukraine to abandon their indigenous languages for Russian or sometimes even Polish. That did not, of course, necessarily mean loyalty to the regime in question. Of all people, the Irish should understand that it is possible to speak the language of the colonizer while identifying with indigenous culture and pledging loyalty to the state associated with it. Yet language shift did make it more difficult for nationalists in Ireland and Ukraine to be taken seriously on the international stage. Both failed to gain recognition at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Irish nationalists struggled for years to convince outsiders that the Irish constituted a nation of their own when the majority spoke English by 1800. Although most Ukrainians continued to speak Ukrainian, they had the difficulty that their language was so close to Russian. Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian all derived from Church Slavonic, but the Russification movement of the late 19th century invented a hierarchy that denigrated Ukrainian and Belarusian as late offshoots of Russian and promoted the title of Little Russia for Ukraine. As a Slavic people and members of the Orthodox Church, Ukrainians could not claim racial or religious difference from the Russians either. Ultimately, as Maciej has pointed out, Ukrainian nationalists overcame these challenges. The problem was that whereas Britain, under the pressure of international public opinion, agreed to concede independence to most of Ireland in 1922, and hence we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the state this year, neither Russia nor Poland would yield to Ukrainian nationalist demands for statehood. Instead, Ukraine became mired in a prolonged military struggle that cost 500,000 Ukrainian lives. Ireland's revolutionary death toll was much lower, 4,000 deaths, just 6% of the proportion of Ukraine. And while Ireland was spared the ravages of World War II, Ukraine suffered enormously with estimated death rates of 7 million, including around 500,000 Jews. If Ukraine parted ways with Ireland in 1922, they reunited in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine's declaration of independence. Both nations had finally emerged from empire to claim statehood for themselves. Yet, while it is perfectly legitimate to invoke this common historical path to encourage Irish people to support Ukraine in its hour of need, it's not actually necessary. The defense of basic democratic values, the right of citizens to decide their own leaders, to choose their allies as they see fit, and to have other states respect their borders, is enough to require all of us, whether the heirs of subject nations of empires or empires themselves, to stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Róisín. That concludes the historical section of our roundtable discussion. Our next two papers deal with information and propaganda. And before I introduce our next speaker, just a quick reminder that anybody who would like to ask a question you're free to type that into the Q&A, and I will read those out when we come to the end of our presentations and our responses. So our next speaker is Dr. Aneta Stępień. Dr. Stępień is lecturer in critical skills at Maynooth University, and her most recent publication is a Polish literary reckoning of the post-World War II population resettlement, the lens of tender narrator. That's forthcoming in the Review of European Studies. Dr. Stępię's paper tonight is titled The Failure of Anti-Ukrainian Propaganda in Poland. Aneta, you have the floor.
Sorry, I just had to stop sharing to turn on my mic. Apologies. Can people hear me and see the slides?
We can hear.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a few slides here. Okay, so in my presentation today, I want to offer a few words, perhaps a critical perspective on the Ukrainian conflict, focusing on the refugee crisis by giving a brief overview of Polish-Ukrainian relations in the recent times, which I think might shed some light on the topic from a slightly different angle. So 6 years ago, I was a lecturer in the Polish Studies program in Trinity College in Dublin, and in one of my modules on contemporary Polish society, I had a student of Ukrainian nationality. In this particular program, students had to spend studying abroad, 1 year abroad. In that case, it was Poland, as that was the language that the students were taking. And upon their return, they would share stories and their experiences. And this particular student, Ukrainian student, shared that, you know, he was terrified and shocked when he witnessed, he shared this moment when he witnessed the Ukrainian flags being burned during the Polish Independence March in Warsaw. And it is known that this particular march in Poland, in Warsaw, is keenly attended by groups of radical nationalists, aggressive hooligans, some of them with Nazi sympathies. So why would Polish nationalists burn Ukrainian flags in 2016 on the Independence March? For many years now, Poland has seen an intensified anti-Ukrainian campaign by the so-called Russian trolls, whose goals has been to discredit Ukraine in the eyes of the Poles. The analysts of Polish internet space noted an unprecedented wave of anti-Ukrainian content and hundreds of new profiles created on social media in the days following the Maidan protests in Kiev in 2013. As this is an event for general audience, just to remind everyone that Maidan or Euromaidan was a wave of demonstrations in November 2013 as a kind of Ukrainian protesters were disappointed with the Ukrainian government sudden decision not to sign the European Union association agreement. And so I think it's important to mention that this is that aspiration of Ukraine to join the EU that was not well received by Putin's government, and that kind of internet disinformation began in Poland, where we saw narratives being spread negatively, which were likely to boost anti-Ukrainian sentiments, such as linking Ukrainians to Nazism, but also negative portrayals of European Union itself. So now, returning to my statement in the title, has this anti-Ukrainian propaganda failed in Poland? Well, if we look at how quickly Polish society mobilized to help the Ukrainian refugees from the first day of the conflict, then yes, it failed. So this is the website Pomoc dla Ukrainy, Dopomoga Ukraini, Facebook website, which was created a day after the conflict has erupted. And as we see, it has 377,000 of members on the 28th of February. Now it is over 500,000 members. It offers all kinds of material help in terms of supplies, organizing donations, but also services such as transport, transporting people from the border, translations, legal aid, medical aid, and so on. I am sure that many of you have stories, have read stories, have seen stories about Polish people helping different, communities, grassroots movements and NGOs, and also the very kind of impressive information infrastructure on the ground and online, as shown in this map of Poles offering all kinds of help. However, we should not ignore certain narratives that that I would describe as a renewal of old wounds towards Ukraine by the Polish government. So since their win in the elections in 2015, the Polish ruling party, Law and Justice, has invested a lot of energy in promoting one particular event in the Polish-Ukrainian history, the 1943 Volenia Massacre, through public commemorations, exhibitions, and state-sponsored films on the topic. This Volenia Massacre refers to an ethnic conflict between Poles and Ukrainians that lasted over 2 years, during which thousands of Poles and Ukrainians were killed in the struggle over territory in Volenia and Eastern Galicia. So yet it is that focus of the Polish government on the Polish victims and this narrative of victimhood and kind of blaming of the Ukrainians for that genocide that is particularly interesting to me. And I want to end with this monument, because I think we have to be very wary. We don't know when and how the conflict in Ukraine will end. And I think we have to be mindful of how these narratives have been playing out and how they will play out in the future. So this is a proposed monument of the Volenia Massacre. And as of 2021, it was decided that it will be located in a border town near Ukrainian border, welcoming the coming Ukrainians, crossing the border to Poland, with this really kind of a brutal kind of image of a child on a pitchfork. So I think we have to be very mindful of these narratives, particularly if the Ukrainian refugees are to stay in Poland longer terms. I wanted to bring a little bit of problematization to that topic. Thank you. That is all.
Okay, thank you so much, Annette. Thank you for this this part of your discussion. Our final speaker tonight is Dr. Maria Falina. Dr. Falina is the assistant professor at the School of History and Geography at Dublin College University. And she is a co-author of the landmark three-volume study, A History of Modern Political Thought in East Central Europe, which was published in 3 or I think maybe even 4 volumes by Oxford University Press between 2016 and 2018. And Dr. Falina's paper this evening is How Can They Believe It? Thinking Behind Putin's Propaganda in Russia. So Maciej, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, very much. And thank you for the previous speakers. A lot of very important points already have been made. So it is a little bit easier in a way for me to make my argument. I suppose what I wanted to talk about today is lots of people, as Maciej has very efficiently demonstrated, have pointed out historical falsehoods and inaccuracies of the propaganda coming out of the Russian side and from the Russian invasion. And it would seem that it's completely nonsensical and doesn't have and has no internal logic or internal coherence. And I think this is not entirely true. So I would suggest that in order to understand why there would be any kind of support for Russian aggression against Ukraine today. And as a bit of caution, we do not have reliable sociology coming out of Russia today. So any guess is as good as yours and mine. Just today I saw a very small, low, sort of 700 people poll, which tracks the dynamic of the public opinion change, and it seems to be changing. So things are really changing very quickly on the ground, day to day, reacting to the current events. But what I would like to talk about is the importance to understand sort of longer term trends of what's been happening in the Russian public sphere for the last 2 decades or so. And I would say that in order to understand what is being told today, the anti-Ukrainian propaganda and also messages justifying the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine needs to be understood through at least 3 different lenses. And one is the idea that it is important for Russia to restore the Soviet greatness. So the famous 2008 speech in which Putin was talking about the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And also here in the same block, we would put the recent, maybe last decade or so, obsession with the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War in the Russian discourse, and the claims that Russia is the main historical heir of the Soviet victory as the positive contribution of the Soviet Union to world history. So the second lens would be the Russian imperial ambition. So here we would have this whole Ruski Mir, Russian world story that I think Maciej also referred to, this East Slavic realm that is historically and justly somehow belonging to this Russian cultural civilizational sphere. And so as a sidetrack from that, we have a very long tradition of sort of Eurasianism and Eurasian ideology, this very strange in-between position of Russia occupying the space in between East and West. And the third very important, probably the most crucial lens here, which somehow receives less media attention, I don't fully understand why, is that the internal Russian discourse has been for the last 2 decades profoundly anti-democratic. And this has to do with the justification for the Putin's regime in the country, and it doesn't call itself obviously authoritarian, it calls itself something else, sovereign democracy, illiberal democracy. There are many words for it. And sort of the internal boogeyman is, the 1990s, the immediate post-Soviet transition of Russia, which is equated with chaos and poverty and criminality. And the opposition to that, the juxtaposition, is the stability that Putin's regime can offer. So sort of law and order, in a way, perverted kind of discourse. So I would say it is through these 3 lenses that we can make sense of otherwise incomprehensible narratives of Ukraine that are coming out of Russia today, that would possibly help us explain how come a vast amount of Russian citizens today are supportive of the aggression of the war, or at the very least not openly sort of shocked and horrified by it. Because if we look at either of the 3 sections, Ukraine is a significant other for Russian history in many ways, very similar with intertwined history, but also importantly different in a way that it is threatening to the Putin's project. So if we look at the heritage of the Soviet Union, it is the fault of Ukraine that the Soviet Union collapses, because it is not the signing of the Beloversky-Pushchi Accords, but rather the Ukrainian referendum and the Ukraine proclaiming its sovereignty that actually, puts the last nail into the coffin of the Soviet Union. The same way, Russian imperial ambitions, there is no Russian world without Ukraine in it. it is an oxymoron. It can only exist if Ukraine is part of this East Slavic Russian imperial construction. And most importantly, the anti-democratic authoritarian part. Putin's narrative and propaganda of Ukraine has been for a very long time denying not only the existence of an independent Ukrainian nation, but more importantly, it's been denying Ukrainian political and historical subjectivity, its political sovereignty and statehood, which would explain why every assertion of Ukrainian statehood and its historical and political agency, when it chooses not to align itself politically with Russia, but with generic West, meets with such incomprehension, but also outrage on the Russian side, be it in 2008, 2013, 14, or today in 2022. So I would say that we need to look at all of these three levels of the internal Russian discourse that would help us understand and interpret how this anti-Ukrainian pro-war, justifying the war and aggression narrative can be constructed and can be consumed by the Russian public. So I think, and I would stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Masha. This Russian angle, of course, remains quite opaque, doesn't it? But it's obviously critical to understanding the invasion and what is happening at the moment. So thank you very much for this. Okay, so that concludes the first part of our discussion. And I want to move on now a little bit more briefly by inviting all of our speakers to respond to what they've heard, to respond to their co-panelists. A reminder that if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, they can type them into the Q&A. Now I can see some questions are already there. Questions are building up, and we will get to those. We'll get to those directly. Maybe I'll start by bringing back to our first speaker, Tanya. Because Tanya, I felt that your paper really was a very good sort of opening act and an overarching, the overarching topic, overarched many of the themes that followed. And I wonder if in your discussion about digital decolonization, you found some strategies that might cope with some of the problems that our latter speakers addressed. So problems of the misuse, the delegitimization of Ukrainian history, or misinformation coming out of other parts, coming out of Russia first and foremost, but also coming out of other parts of the online sphere. So I wonder if you've detected some strategies for coping and for dealing with those sorts of problems.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That's a very good question. I think there's certainly an understanding, where like these key disinformation or delegitimization topics or themes are. And what I've seen, I mean, obviously, again, some of this is not new, but we've seen a kind of concerted effort to fill the information space, lest it be left a kind of vacuum for misinformation to just float around in there with, on the one hand, useful historical context and facts. So I've seen, a lot of people, well, obviously lots of people are posting news and updates, but a good number of Ukrainian experts and journalists are also posting historical context, right? So they're suggesting useful readings, key books by, historians such as Sergei Plokhy and a lot of others who are, big names who've written about Ukraine for years and who provide that important context. So, sort of fighting these imaginaries of Ukraine as not a real country, etc., or as a lesser people somehow with those very specific historical contextual interventions, but also, alluding to the rich cultural and historical legacy that Ukraine and Ukrainians have developed over time, right? So referring to the many artists, writers, all of those other kind of historical and cultural personalities, many of whom are known around the world, but people don't necessarily often think of them, say, as Ukrainians, or, so just trying to kind of bring that context for Ukraine as a nation, and a people that has existed for quite a while. And I think the other thing that I've seen, and this is more along the lines of what I was talking about with regard to articulation and translation, is people calling attention to the language that is being used by mainstream media, but especially Western media, but also just by people generally in conversation, from how we refer to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? We're not calling it the Ukrainian situation, we're calling it Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or Russia's war on Ukraine. And just being very, I think, specific with what language we use to describe the parties involved, what is actually happening, how we refer to civilian lives that have been lost, all of those things, right? And I think that's really important, because as we know, language is often a victim of convenience, or we just choose a thing that's shorter. But Ukrainians have been basically saying it's really, really important to pay attention to how you describe what's going on, who you assign agency to, who you blame for things that are happening, and what words you use, because I think it's hugely important, because we are in an information space where words are incredibly important, and words get picked up and things go viral. So it's very, very important to pay attention to not just the facts and the context, but also the language.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. And maybe if I could just ask one very quick follow-up, because it's quite closely related to your topic once again. You spoke a lot about grassroots mobilization and bottom-up strategies for dealing with some of these problems. But of course, there is another part of this, and that's the top-down responses from tech companies and broadcasters, and they have been quite visible and quite active in this. So I want, maybe it's too soon to start asking these questions, alone answering them, but I wonder if you had any thoughts about the response from tech giants such as Twitter and other social media providers in dealing with some of the problems that you and our other speakers have identified.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously been quite high on the radar in terms of conversation. And I don't think anybody necessarily has a clear answer on whether it's right or wrong. There's been a lot of criticism, say, of Facebook and Meta and other tech giants of, either blocked or removed advertising funding from Russia's state media channels. And like some people have said, well, this is only going to be detrimental for, say, foreign media working in Russia, because they're going to basically be on the, on the receiving end of similar treatment. I think, though, that it's important to acknowledge in this case that we're not just dealing with an information war, but that the content and the propaganda and the disinformation that these channels produce, and that's predominantly what they produce, they don't just contribute to the creation of some kind of online or digital unreality, as Peter Pomerantsev says, but they're also impacting the lives of people on the ground, right? And they are directly related to the things that are happening on the ground. And on the ground, what we're seeing is huge loss of civilian life, essentially a humanitarian catastrophe. So, I'm not being a proponent of censorship necessarily, but I think it's important to understand that what these media whose channels are being censored are providing has nothing to do with reality. They're still available to people in Russia, and what we see there is a complete basically rejection of what is actually happening on the ground. There is no reporting of any real losses. There is a misrepresentation of what is actually happening, what is Russia is actually doing in Ukraine. And so, we are in a crisis, we're in a critical moment when sometimes you do need to cut off those channels of information when it's clear that they have nothing to do with the reality of what's happening on the ground. So I think it's going to be a while before we see whether this was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. But, I think we just need to be very clear, because we've seen the consequences of what happens when you don't cut off access to misinformation, or in countries like Myanmar, where there have also been huge losses of civilian lives. And, so I think the platforms probably have also learned from those previous situations.
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree. This is sort of something that the learning curve is quite steep, isn't it? And as you were talking, I was just thinking about some of the problems caused in the US surrounding this insurrection of the 6th of January and the role that the dissemination of fake news and misinformation caused in that. And it might be that at some point we need to sort of put all of this together and try to work out what happened. Do any of the co-panelists, any other panelists would like to add to anything that we've heard tonight, would like to comment or respond to anything that anybody else has said in this evening's? Just simply sort of unmute yourself and speak, or Maciej, I can see you've unmuted yourself.
No, I'm just waiting for the questions from the audience, and when we answer those, I think we could go back to conversation between ourselves, because I've seen that there's a good few of them waiting now.
Okay, I think that's a very good suggestion. So so let's do that straight away. So the first question is from Alison Herbert, and Alison is wondering about the slur of Nazism that has been directed against Ukraine by Russia, and of course Putin himself has laid out one of the war objectives as the denazification of Ukraine. So it's a question really about sort of history and information. Would anyone like to sort of try to explain to the audience where that slur is coming from and what it means rhetorically?
I mean, I would probably kick this off. I think both Maciej and Tanya also have something to say on this. Well, I think first we need to, it has to be very clear that denazification as a military or political goal is such a vague thing that it's a goal that cannot be fulfilled because it has not been defined, but provided with any specific meaning by the Russian side. So what they mean really is the sort of total rejection of Ukrainian sovereignty, statehood, and the existence of independent Ukrainian nation. So it's the equation of Ukrainian statehood to extreme far-right aggressive nationalism that has to be eradicated, and the presentation of Russian side as the liberator of the subjugated population that doesn't know that it's subjugated. So the Russian side continuously presents itself also in the domestic Russian media as a liberator, coming to liberate the subjugated people of Ukraine. It also comes from a very long tradition of sort of pride, but also lately very militarized understanding of the Soviet contribution to the defeat of Nazism in the Second World War. So it builds on a decade of Russian public being educated that the Soviet Union has won the Second World War. And then, and it is doing it again by conquering, Ukrainian Nazis without anybody really giving a second thought as to what that actually means.
Thank you, Maria. Go ahead, Maciej. Maciej, then Tanya.
All right. So I just want to pick up on what Masha have said, and also what Aneta said in her presentation. So in this sort of I'm going to keep using the word propaganda because this is probably the best way to describe this sort of narratives. It's this one strain of Ukrainian nationalism, which is a multifaceted phenomenon, that there is an intellectual current, the process that was happening over centuries, that they've picked on one strain that gained a certain prominence in this during the mess of the Second World War and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and they picked on the organization of the Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army, the famous UPA, that got, as I said in my presentation, got used in many ways as well as a tools of Hitler's politics. And those groups, but not only them, like, you know, as I said as well, Home Army in Poland, like, you know, the underground army that fought Nazis and protected the population throughout the German occupation from 1939 till 1945. They were also portrayed as Nazi collaborators, as enemies, and loads of them ended up murdered and sent to Siberia, shot, tortured in the Soviet prisons. So this is the same sort of narrative that it's to justify why we have to get rid of those people. You know, that it has nothing to do with truth, right? I mean, the Ukrainian insurgent army during the fights there in Volenia and Eastern Galicia, they've committed crimes. Definitely, there are certain battalions participated both in Holocaust and in the massacres of the Poles. But the thing is that this was one strain of Ukrainian nationalism that in a Russian propaganda used both in Russia, Ukraine, and around the world. It's blown out of proportion. It's made a lot bigger than it ever actually was, and that's the problem. Like, you know, and in Poland, it's there are historical debates about this all the time. I think one of the good books about this that deals with this, and it's in English, that deals with this problem. It's one of the old books by Timothy Snyder, The Resurrection of the Nations, or Reconstruction of the Nation. I think that's it. And this one presents the most leveled approach to this, right? Instead of, I think that's good as well to read the historians that are not emotionally involved, like, you know, like the Poles, Ukrainians. They would be like, you know, there's certain historians like Polishchuk, for example, that would have more emotions involved. But like, I think Snyder's, out of the ones that I read about this, Snyder's was one that presented quite balanced opinions about this. So that's that from me now.
Thank you, Maciej. Go ahead, Tanya.
Yeah, I just add a few words, and also so continuing to answer this question, but also maybe picking up on Jana Fischerova's question about, you know, how real is a problem? Is neo-Nazi ideology really a problem in Ukraine? I think again what we're dealing with is picking up on something that is an issue, is a much smaller issue than it's made out to be. Like any country, Ukraine obviously has certain, not just political parties, but maybe also grassroots movement that subscribe to certain ideas, to certain far-right ideologies. In Ukraine, these elements are fairly marginal. They don't really have any real political representation, for instance, in parliament, or, you know, like none of those parties got any visible representation. They exist, and because they exist, and obviously, you know, they are critiqued by both media and scholars and, you know, other forces, political forces that subscribe to a left ideology. They can be used, and they are used, especially by Russian propaganda, as scarecrows. So yes, they are certainly a problem, as in any other country. In some European countries, these far-right forces are much more prevalent. They have much more political say. However, what we're dealing with, right, as Maria and Maciej both pointed out, is this message that, you know, Russia is coming to Ukraine to denazify it, but none of the people that are currently ruling the country, including the current president, who is himself of Jewish origin and whose family, many of whose family members perished during the Holodomor and the Holocaust, like none of them are there to be denazified because they're not part of that ideology. So I think it's, you know, it is like picking up on a problem that does exist, that is much smaller than it's made out to be, and using it to blow the propagandistic messages out of proportion, but that's not actually what is happening in Ukraine.
No, I completely agree, and I suspect that this charge of denazification is a euphemism for simply removing the current government and replacing it with one that's more amenable to Putin into the Kremlin, and this is actually the true meaning of this notional denazification. Okay, so thank you for that. The questions are coming in. Just very quickly to our panelists. I'm moderating the session, but if anybody wants to, you can see and read the questions as well. So if there's something that you want to jump in on, then by all means do so. I might scroll down a little bit and move to a question that comes from Eva Vukusic. And Eva is asking, first of all, she's thanking you for the all for the panel and found it very informative. And she asks a question for anybody who wants to take it. Is there a way this leads to Putin's fall? Numerous analyses emphasize that we do not know how this ends. However, it hasn't been going as well as Putin planned, it seems. Is there a credible scenario which leads to Putin's fall? And who would come in his place, given the suppression of opposition for years? Thank you. Masha, maybe that's a question for you, given that your paper dealt with the angle in Russia. Would you like to have a go at that? Game?
I think don't we all want to know, right? I think in the absence of crystal ball, we don't really know what exactly will lead to the fall of Putin's regime. Be it the economic sanctions or military defeat or an internal coup or the elite split. I'm not going to speculate here now because I can't. But I do want to say, and I think it is very important, is that the last 10 years, since basically in Russia, since the 2011 mass protests about the falsifications of electoral results, despite increasingly harsh repressions on political opposition and civil society, have seen an amazing growth of horizontal networks of civil society that have prepared not necessarily the sort of smooth transition to post-Putin future, but it's not scorched earth. And I think this is very important that we keep in mind. I would be very wary of trying to find one person and then pin all our hopes on one person. If Khodorkovsky returns from his exile to Russia, then this will happen. If Navalny is released from prison alive, then this will happen. This is not what will, if anything will save Russia, it's this horizontal networks and development of civil society, not a miraculous new leader who will solve all the problems. That is definitely not the answer. And for that, the development of horizontal networks, bizarrely, I'm kind of hopeful. We have seen in the last 10 years, huge growth of the charities and the NGO sector. We have seen significant growth of political self-mobilization outside of big cities, outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It is very significant. And if people now are following the anti-war protests, which in absolute numbers are minuscule, but it is important that they're happening not just in big cities. They are happening all over the country, and they have been, so anti-Putin, anti-regime protests has been happening all over the country. For the last maybe year and a half. And that is a qualitative change compared to what we've seen in 2011. So this is that. So this is one thing that sort of allows me to remain somewhat hopeful for the maybe not short term, but medium to long term future of Russia.
I'll get back to the questions momentarily, but I wonder, just to sort of keep the thread of this conversation going, a question for Aneta, and again, I'm sorry to say it's based on this sort of prediction game. The Polish response has been striking, hasn't it? It's been at the forefront of the EU response, and of course, it's been at the forefront of the of this refugee crisis, which is steepening and which is worsening, and which shows all signs of getting much worse in the coming days and weeks. Do you think there's going to be a profound effect and a profound change in Polish foreign and domestic policy as a result of the war and as a result of the attendant crises? That's a question for Aneta, maybe.
Well, it's a great question, and again, it's hard to predict. But what I can say is that obviously the impact of the conflict it's already huge. You know, it has had a huge impact on the society. I just want to give one example, which relates a little bit to what Tanya said about the importance of considering Ukraine in post-colonial lens. And also, I think Róisín talked about that, you know, Poland kind of dominating over Ukraine. There has been a huge debate, and actually everybody started applying this and kind of an urge to change the language in which we refer to Ukraine. So in Polish, to say in Ukraine, you can say w Ukrainie or na Ukrainie. And there's a huge difference, both translate as in Ukraine, but w Ukrainie, actually the prefix, the preposition v is used for a country, while na is used for a region. So we have been using in standardized Polish na Ukrainie, which means in that region of like as of region of Poland, you know, which shows this kind of certain kind of perhaps imperialist outlook. And now if you look at the social media page that I was showing, everybody and journalists, you know, and people in their comments, they started using w Ukrainie to recognize that Ukraine is a country, you know, and there's there has been that discussion, and some linguistic experts are speaking about absolute, you know, urgency to actually, you know, because this conflict is about that, it's about Ukraine's, you know, kind of right to be sovereign, right, and be recognized as an independent country. My interest is to see how the situation will develop between the society and the responses of society and the direction of the politics, of the Polish politics, because, you know, our government is also becoming increasingly you know, anti-democratic, trying to control media and so on. I hope I will be able to go back, you know, and travel to Poland, and I won't be, you know, stopped at the border for saying this. But we observe that. So, you know, maybe will the society have that reflection that the government is kind of becoming increasingly authoritarian, and what could the danger be, and again thinking about what's the long-term relationship if you know this conflict is gonna last longer. And yeah, so I just wanted to give an example of this small change that is happening in the language, and I think it's very, very important.
And I'll just jump in to say that this is very similar to what kind of, well, what Ukrainians have been trying to argue with the Russians about, because in Russian it's very typical to say na Ukrainie, whereas Ukrainians always come into the chat and say, no, it's actually v. And now you can almost look at Russian independent media and see which of them have changed to using v Ukrainian and be like, okay, that's how you know what their position is.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a question from Joe Hayes, and Joe is in fact a practitioner. He thanks all of you for your interesting insights, and he says that he served for a few short years as Ireland's non-resident ambassador to Ukraine. And he says one challenge that EU representatives faced when trying to convey reliable assessments of Ukrainian foreign policy objectives back to their headquarters was a perception of a deep fracture between pro-Western Ukrainian politicians and those whose long-term ambitions looked to Russia. And he would like to hear panel views on that. I get the feeling, I think that's probably another question for Tanya, but before I throw over to Tanya, I sort of get the feeling from listening to Ukrainian friends and colleagues these last few days that those fractures have really become much more shallow, not just as a result of the invasion, but also things like the Maidan. I mean, they do seem to be great sort of self-determining moments for Ukraine, great moments of a sort of summoning of civic Ukrainian identity. But go ahead, Tanya. I feel like you're I know we're putting a lot of limelight on you tonight, but it does feel like you're the
Sure.
best
Well, I
person
mean,
to answer
I'm
that.
also happy for others to jump in, but just to briefly say that, I mean, certainly, you know, since 2014, especially before that, there were obvious kind of political cleavages, if not necessarily, you know, cleavages within society so much, because, you know, it's obviously not just about the language people speak or like what direction of Ukrainian friendship they support, be it, you know, a move towards the EU in the West or Russia, but I mean, and that, you know, all those things were like tied in with like previous relationships, historic ties, economic relationships, familial ties. You know, lots of Ukrainians have relatives in Russia, but obviously Ukrainians in, say, the east of Ukraine have more relatives in Russia just because of the geography, you know. But there's also other historical movements and kind of migrations that have informed this history. But I think since 2014 especially, and, you know, since not just the Euromaidan, which brought people together and created those cross-cleavage coalitions that Oля Ono speaks to so eloquently in her research, we've also, you know, Ukraine has been experiencing Russian aggression since 2014 at the very least, with the illegal annexation of Crimea, and, you know, fomenting and supporting rebellions in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. So while some of those divisions remained in the kind of elite political sphere, the divisions became less and less, and they're now almost inexistent because of the existential threat to the existence of Ukraine as a country. So today what we're seeing is, yes, obviously the Ukraine has an opposition, and that opposition currently, you know, the opposition parties in parliament are technically pro-Russian, but even within those parties, there are now a number of politicians who are supporting Ukraine. You know, they're not all supporting Putin and Putin's invasion. And specifically in terms of local politics, like if we look at cities like Mariupol in the Donetsk region and Kherson, Odessa, who are now all experiencing the brunt of Russia's military attack, there are people, even in those towns that are currently under Russian occupation, like Kherson, where people come out with Ukrainian flags every day and protest and sing, you know, the Ukrainian national anthem. And the local authorities, like the mayors or the governors, are all explicitly saying that we're not going to give in, we're not going to just surrender to Russian forces. So, you know, the conversation has shifted from maybe more pragmatic considerations of, well, should we be friends with Russia or and keep developing an economic relationship with Russia? Now, the conversation is not about that, it's about survival. And so those divisions have stopped having any meaning, because it's either we survive as a country and as Ukrainians, or we don't. So I think it's been a huge shift. And even in the past couple of weeks, that shift has almost disappeared, or that distinction.
Thank you. I have a question here from Paul Campbell, and it's more of a comment actually, but we might turn this into a sort of interrogative point. He mentions that President Zelensky in the last 30 minutes is finished addressing the House of Commons. So it was due today at the UK Parliament, received a standing ovation, which is quite uncharacteristic, of course, but it's actually not within the House rules. So that's quite remarkable. Historic address by the Ukrainian president by responding to words from the main political parties. Róisín, do you have any thoughts about, bearing in mind that probably you, like the rest of us, haven't seen this address yet, but maybe the image and the figure of Zelensky abroad, and particularly in the UK and Ireland, and the response of those two countries to the invasion and to the war, because in many ways they've been quite divergent, haven't they? So did you have any thoughts about Zelensky in the UK and Ireland?
Well, I think Zelensky has obviously been feted here as a fantastic resistance leader and being very impressive in terms of staying put in Ukraine when so many other leaders under similar circumstances fled the scene. So I think there's a huge amount of respect for him there. I mean, it amused me when Putin describes him as a dope addict, and you see this very vital looking person. So I think literally, physically he embodies that spirit of vital resistance against the Russians. And I think, it has mobilized a lot of support for the Ukrainians here. I'm not as familiar, to be honest, with what's happening in the UK. I didn't see that speech. I think what you do see is a striking difference in the response to refugees. Here a much greater willingness to take them on. I think that does come from a sense of historic solidarity, and also in a very formal sense from the fact that we are in the EU, whereas Britain seems to be taking advantage of Brexit to sort of dodge its kind of responsibility in that sense. I mean, these are very early days, and it remains to be seen what happens. And I think we should give everybody a chance to adjust. It's only been kind of 2 weeks. I know our own Minister for Justice was coming under pressure today. Have you got everything set up? Are there people there at the airport to welcome people? And I think we need to give everybody time, I think, to cope with that. But so far, I think the response from the EU has been exceptional. It probably is going to be, insufficient, or there will always be a time lag. But I think it speaks very favorably for civil society and the institutions of the EU, I would think.
Okay, and Róisín, if I may stick with you for a moment, because we do have a question directly related to the presentation that you gave. This is from Hardy Schwamm, and Hardy asks, Róisín, what do we learn from the Ireland-Ukraine comparison regarding the current conflict? And would you extend your comparison to include other peoples and nations? The Basque come to mind, or possibly others in Eastern Europe. So I wonder, Róisín, if you have any thoughts about Hardy's question.
Yeah, it's hard to see any kind of immediate parallel. I suppose you'd nearly have to go back to the 16th and 17th centuries to look at a point where a neighbor invaded another sovereign nation. So it's hard to draw any immediate parallel there. You could look, I suppose, at the revolutionary period, and what I think is interesting there, the Irish revolutionary period, is the kind of warfare that undermined the British, in terms of guerrilla warfare, was very effective. But what is also interesting here is that that's not ultimately what was defeated the British. It wasn't a military victory that led to the Anglo-Irish negotiations and the truce and the treaty. Rather, it was the battle for public opinion. And the fact that the black and tan atrocities were broadcast around the world and reflected very badly on the British. And I think here there probably is a lesson for the Ukrainians, although I don't think they need it. I think they're doing pretty well on their own, to be honest. The fact that this is happening in real time, that we're getting people, on their phones, telling exactly the kind of experiences that they've had, that we're getting pictures directly from Kyiv and other cities of bombings, means that, we can see exactly what's happening. And I think, talking about Zelensky again, and he's a very effective communicator, and I think he's getting the message out very fast. I suppose the problem is, it was possible to shame the British, in 1922. I'm not sure if it's possible to shame Putin in the same way. So, this comes back to the same question: how are we going to bring it to an end? And will it be people inside Russia who are going to do that, perhaps even within his own immediate circle? It's very hard to know what impact international public opinion will have on him. And so I just thought that the last part of the question, to come back to the whole question of other parallels. I mean, absolutely. I mean, Ireland and Ukraine are part of a whole series of small nations, you could say, small nations in inverted commas. Ukraine is very large, that suffered at the hands of empire, and Poland next door, the Czechs, Slovaks, etc. So there are lots of these. I suppose what's interesting about the Ukrainians, in relative terms, they come to nationhood quite late. But I think we need to be very careful about not having some sort of hierarchy of nations, and that you're better if you get there first. There are specific historical reasons why countries get there first. I mean, in Ireland it was, I think, because of the trauma of that invasion in the 16th and 17th century, the centuries that experience of conquest. Those experiences come a little bit later and more gradual in the case of Ukraine. But it doesn't really matter if the Ukrainians think they're a nation and they have an independent sovereign state, then they deserve as much support as anybody else.
I have a question that I'll just throw open to anybody in the panel. It comes from Gary Elbert. And Gary asks, why does the panel think Putin has decided that February 2022 is the time to invade Ukraine? Military experts are stating that the operation is poorly planned. The panel here generally seem to agree. that his reasons for the invasion are superficial propaganda. So why now? I must admit I have a couple of thoughts about this, but let's put that open to the panel.
I don't know if anybody wants to jump on that.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
well,
Maria.
I have some. I mean, I'm not an expert in illegal international aggression, but it would seem that, well, it seems they've been waiting for the end of the Olympics to begin with, as sort of the immediate sort of timing. Very interestingly, energy experts in terms of energy security in Europe are telling us that now is the best time for Russia to attack, because most of Europe is absolutely dependent on Russian gas, because they're transitioning under the EU Green Deal, and they have closed down a lot of the brown coal facilities and are reluctant to use nuclear energy facilities. So as a transitional period, a lot of this, the EU Green Deal is reliant on Russian gas. So we've seen today from the European Commission statement that they're going to change some of the energy policies. So, but that definitely, I think, was part of the calculation. So I would say that those probably were, sorry, yeah, Conrad.
Okay, if I may, so one more thing that I believe that because choosing this moment is the debacle of the Afghanistan retreat. Americans' failure in maintaining the government that they've armed, that they've trained, that they've supplied for so many years. That showed the weakness of the West to Putin. I think that's what gave him this feeling that I can do this. There is a weak leadership of the West. I have enough support in European Union to withstand any sanctions that they might throw at me. And I think that there was a miscalculation as well of how well the Ukrainians are prepared and how well will they defend. So I think all those things combined together, and the things that Masha mentioned as well, that the transition is happening to the green energy, and this that we are so dependent on Russian gas, all of those combined together, said now or never, and yeah, so I think that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Maciej, and I've been thinking these last few days. I wonder also, it is obviously not going to plan, is it? I mean, there's no way that the Putin planned these sorts of losses and this kind of, this is obviously not plan A. So something has gone off the rails. But I mean, I wonder if the person who asked the question mentioned Crimea. And sometimes I wonder if Putin had in mind the operation to annex Crimea, which was just this sort of, these little green men, wasn't it, these special forces surrounding government administrative buildings. And this happened very quickly. The Ukrainian government was quite disoriented and was not able to respond in a timely fashion. And I wonder if he imagined that the actual war, the invasion, would be basically like the annexation of Crimea, but on a larger scale. To just involve parachuting guys in, surrounding administrative and government buildings, decapitating the government, and then rolling these kind of convoys in to sort of, present the people with a fait accompli. And obviously, it hasn't happened like that.
Yeah. If I may just add a few thoughts to this, and I think there's probably something there. I think a lot of this also becomes maybe more realistic if we think about the way Putin has basically ruled Russia and the way he's kind of conducted his politics, where even from his meetings with his milieu and the Security Council and his closest colleagues, it's evident that everybody is very, very afraid, and I think that also means that probably they're also afraid to tell him the truth. Because obviously Putin, in Putin's government, in the Kremlin, there's been, I'm sure, a large team of people, largely led by Surkov, I think, who has kind of been focusing on Ukraine, and since, well, before 2014, but especially since 2014, working with Crimea, working with Donbass. And that team, according to some independent media reports that we've seen from Russia, has been, they've been given quite a lot of funding to conduct their work. Whether or not they actually spend that funding on conducting the work and preparing the ground, we don't really know. And knowing what we know about corruption in Russia's, political circles and government circles, probably not. But again, right, it's one thing what they're actually doing on the ground and how and who they're trying to recruit as their allies and what they're reporting back to the person in the Kremlin, right? Those are two different things. So I think, again, part of it is that just by virtue of how his regime has evolved, there's also that danger for him that he's not really being told what is happening, right? Like he doesn't sit on Telegram and Twitter, he gets printouts. So it's very likely that probably he maybe didn't, or he had a very distorted picture of what was actually happening in Ukraine, and the decisions that he made were maybe made not with the best information. And that's why, instead of getting things done in 48 hours, they're now stuck in day, whatever it is, 12 or 13, and lots of people are dead, and lots of tanks and airplanes are destroyed. Right, so I think it's a combination of all of those factors, and plus also the same corruption also is something that is affecting the army and the military as well in Russia, right?
I very quickly on this point. Actually, Stephen Cockin recently made quite similar points about the narrowing of this autocracy in the Kremlin. There's no corrective measures, there's no opposition, political opposition, there's no one to answer back to him, no one dares do this, no one dares bring bad information, and so I completely agree, Tanya. I guess I would also add that there's no opposition media either, there's no independent media, which of course plays, there is, but it's so sort of suppressed and persecuted.
There is, but he doesn't subscribe to Meduza or Nova Gazeta.
Go ahead, Maciej.
Yeah, I mean, I think on top of everything that's Tanya said about the decision-making process, which I think is probably very true. Another thing that the Russian sort of, the political elite, but also the general public is repeatedly misunderstanding, and I think it has come as a shock. People tend to equate people living in Ukraine speaking Russian as identifying culturally and politically with Russia, and that is absolutely not true. And I think that is the message that hasn't fully sunk in yet on the Russian side of it. So, and I think, I mean, we know that Kharkiv, Odessa or used to be until very recently, Russian-speaking urban centers. These are centers of, linguistically Russian, but it doesn't make them politically lenient to Russia and Russian foreign policy in Ukraine. So I think people have miscalculated the alliance, with the Russian cultural sphere, and equated that with people's acceptance of anti-democratic authoritarian regime. And the Ukrainian people have repeatedly demonstrated that they value democracy and statehood over whatever language they're talking and using in day-to-day communication. And I think I'm seeing this in the media, also in Western reports as well, and this is very troubling. The equation of the language people use with ethnicity, with political allegiance and loyalty to the state, and that is very troubling and very problematic.
And there's one more thing, part of this, that he's surrounded by yes men and start believing his own propaganda. There's one more thing that even though in 2014 Ukrainian economy suffered after annexation of Crimea, after creation of those fake separatist republics in Donbass and Lugansk, there's one thing that the Ukrainian economy started rebounding, started growing really fast. So if Putin would allow that to happen, he would have the same problem that he has with Baltic states, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on. That the people who align themselves with the West suddenly are starting to getting rich faster than the Russians. and how does this really present his illiberal democracy, his hierarchic structures that are so much Russian and so based on tradition, and how does this look for an average Russian, like, you know? So if we're gonna get rid of you, we will get finally better lives, like the people in Ukraine or in Estonia, in Latvia, and so on, like, you know. So that would be like a final nail to his coffin, like, you know, or the coffin of the whole system that he managed to create, this post-Soviet structures of power.
Okay, we're running down on time, and there's so many questions and so much more to be said about this topic. And I must say that the attendance also has been extremely good, and it's you know, it's just an evidence of how much interest there is in this incredibly important topic. But if the panelists will humor me, we have one last question, and I'm going to go down to a question from Catherine Lombard. Catherine is asking about okay, it's about NATO, and asking about NATO expansionism. I wouldn't use this term. I think that's quite a problematic term, expansion. But nevertheless, it has been very central to Russian propaganda about the conflict. So I wonder if anyone would like to, I think, essentially debunk this notion of NATO. Would anyone like to comment on the way this has been used rhetorically in as a pretext for the conflict?
I just have a quite short comment, you know, that the NATO expansion as a term, it's very derogatory. It takes away the agency from nearly 100 million people living in Central Europe who were part of the Soviet sphere of influence, or in the satellite states, or in the former republics like Ukraine or Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and that takes away the agency. And this it's not even problematic. I think it's quite offensive, really. Like, you know, thinking of a NATO expansion, in order to get to NATO, that the state has to apply. The state has to meet the conditions and requirements in order to get there. The same with the European Union. You can try and apply, but you're not going to be taken in. It's a club. It's while the Ruski Mir, in this case, at least the way it's imagined by Putin, we can compare it. Exclusive club on one side. On the other side, you have a local mob that forces you to pay for protection from itself, like, you know. So that's the difference. There is no NATO expansion. There are states and peoples who want to be protected from this local mobsters, and that's it from me.
Yeah, I can add just a few thoughts. I think, again, I would agree with Maciej that, you know, it's this whole rhetoric of NATO expansion is a convenient bogeyman that Russia uses. It's also used by Russia in the terms that it understands spheres of influence and how states make decisions, or how decisions are made for them. The issue here is not NATO expansion. States, as Maciej said, are sovereign. They make decisions about whether or not they want to apply. That's what states do. And then NATO, within its membership, makes decisions about whether or not and on what premises and how quickly it accepts certain states into its defensive alliance. I mean, you know, I think here it's really, we shouldn't be talking about NATO expansion. We should be talking about the state's sovereign rights to self-determination and deciding who and how they want to be allied with, because that's the key issue. It's not NATO expansion. It's the sovereignty and agency of independent countries that's in question and that's under threat.
And I think on that note, the an efficient counter argument to, you know, undocumented verbal promises to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand is the documented international 1994 Budapest Accords, which internationally guarantee territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange of Ukraine giving up the nuclear weapons as part of the nuclear disarmament. Why are we picking up the NATO expansion rhetoric while we have an alternative narrative, which is very well documented? We don't need to guess, and it's entrenched in international law. So I would switch the discussion to there from, what if kind of scenarios.
Róisín or Annette, maybe not exactly addressing the four-letter word NATO, but perhaps thinking more generally about security arrangements and security architecture. That does seem to be something that these might change the way people think about these things. This invasion, and of course, Ireland is not a NATO member. It maintains its neutrality, but there has been some discussion about that. Whereas, of course, Poland is a member and is, I think, quite grateful for that membership. So, Róisín, do you have any thoughts about that, about Ireland, and about more generally European security going forward?
I mean, I really hope this does provoke a discussion about neutrality in Ireland, because it's been a bit of a holy cow for many years, and often justified on the basis of, us having gained our sovereignty and wanting to sort of assert it. This is the justification for Ireland being neutral in World War II, and while that might be understandable, we now are 100 years old, and I think it's time we started to take responsibility for our defense. I mean, our military, as the recent report showed, is a severely under-resourced, the personnel underpaid. We wouldn't be able to defend ourselves against anything. So I think simply as a matter of self-preservation in a modern world, we need to invest in it and think very carefully about the different options, because NATO is one option, but it's not the only option on the table. I think there may be some kind of closer relationship to an EU defence arrangement that I think might be more acceptable to people, because understandably, some people are concerned about the I suppose the democratic credentials or sustainability of some partners within it outside of Europe. But I think we definitely need to start thinking about it, and I think the sort of proposal that Macron is making for some kind of stronger European EU security dimension, I think would probably be a more acceptable option to many Irish people than NATO membership.
Annette, do you have any thoughts about NATO in Central and Eastern Europe, or?
Well, I'm just thinking about, the interesting kind of narrative of NATO countries, kind of, and whether they should be involved or not involved because of the escalation of the problem. I'm wondering, whether that would come to bite, these kind of opposing NATO getting involved. We see the threats to the Baltic republics already from Putin. So, I really, honestly, I don't have much to say on that, but I'm wondering, if that kind of intervention is actually needed to stop the madman, So.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting what Tanya says about flipping this discussion on its head and saying that it's a sovereign decision of these states. Coming from the UK, it's interesting to hear this part of the discourse, the Brexit discourse, saying that membership in these international institutions is a loss of sovereignty, when in fact, as we see from looking at the situation of Ukraine, wanting to make its own decisions about international partnerships and security, international security, this is actually an assertion of sovereignty. It's not at all a loss of sovereignty. Listen, it's obvious that we can go on, and we will do in the coming days. But we're running out of time. So let me very briefly say, first of all, of course, this evening was all about Ukraine, and the following days and weeks will also be about Ukraine. But I just wanted to thank all of our panelists. They're all academics based in Ireland. And this simply, for me, shows the depth and the breadth of expertise, regional expertise, interdisciplinary expertise we have in the region. And that also speaks to a great sort of societal response to the war in Ukraine. And I'm hoping that in the coming days and weeks, this will have sort of material benefits that Ireland will play an important role, if not in resolving, then at least in sort of mitigating the worst parts of this crisis. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to first and foremost to our panelists, all five of them. Thank you to the John Moores Institute for hosting us tonight. Thank you to the association, the Irish Association of Russian, Central and Eastern European Studies, for co-hosting, and thank you once again to all of our people, everybody who came and joined us tonight. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all of your questions, but these are very much ongoing conversations and ongoing discussions. So thank you all very much, and good evening to you.